Greetings, everyone. This is Anime Octopus, and I extend a warm welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, our fanfiction topic is: what if Naruko were a young prodigy? Part 5. Disclaimer: the content on this channel is for entertainment and discussion purposes only. I do not own any of the anime footage used in my videos. All rights and credits go to their respective creators and copyright holders. Let's begin our discussion. Hoshi was taken aback by the unexpected defeat at the hands of her opponent. Within a mere 6 minutes, Nobu of Kumo had triumphed over Hoshi with a meticulously crafted strategy and a potent lightning jutsu. Mikoto took this opportunity to educate her astonished students on the nature of the Aburame clan's abilities. Although not a bloodline limit, their unique powers were a double-edged sword. Sharing their bodies with insects, the Aburame lacked the proficiency in ninjutsu that other shinobi possessed. Nonetheless, there were exceptional individuals within the clan who exhibited greater ninjutsu capabilities than many non-clan shinobi. Reliance on their insects, which could drain an enemy's chakra, often led to complacency. However, there were numerous ways to counter such tactics. Mikoto herself could readily list a dozen methods. Nobu had executed a straightforward yet effective distraction technique, ultimately incapacitating Hoshi with a well-placed strike to the back of her head. The ease of Nobu's victory underscored the need for vigilance. He was clearly not to be underestimated. The second match proved more exhilarating, albeit marginally. Natsuki of Kiri, a striking girl with short, spiky black hair, pastel green eyes devoid of pupils, and pale skin, appeared to be around 13 years old. Among the remaining Jinan, Team Mikoto and Team 2 of Konoha were the youngest to have advanced past the second phase of the exam. Naruto, adorned in her usual attire, sported a loose ponytail at the nape of her neck. Her typical hair clip was absent, allowing her bangs to fall naturally around her face, save for the portion secured in the ponytail. As the proctor initiated the match, it commenced with Natsuki's attack. Suten, Suiben, water release, water whip, she exclaimed, closing the distance. Naruto, having trained with the Uchiha from a young age, had honed her speed and seal formation skills. As the water whip approached, she completed the seals for her own jutsu. Katen, Gokaku no Jutsu, fire release, great fireball technique. Although a C-rank jutsu, Naruto knew that sufficient chakra control could elevate its power. With her refined chakra control, she enhanced the technique to nearly an A-rank level. Over the years, she had dedicated herself to mastering chakra control, achieving commendable proficiency despite her inability to perform genjutsu. Her training with the Uchiha had also endowed her with fire jutsu skills, enabling her to counter Natsuki's water whip with a significantly larger fireball. Natsuki, forced to evade the enlarged fireball, acknowledged Naruto's versatility. "So, you don't just know wind jutsu," she remarked, her eyes narrowing. Naruto assumed a defensive stance, prepared for whatever Natsuki might attempt. "Wind is my primary affinity, but fire is just a secondary interest," she retorted. Natsuki smirked, and Naruto felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned swiftly and gasped as a foot planted itself in her stomach, sending her sprawling to the ground. Behind her stood another Natsuki, a clone, she realized with astonishment. How had she managed to get a clone behind her? More perplexingly, how had she created one without a substantial water source nearby? Or was the one who attacked her even a clone at all? These questions raced through her mind as she quickly regained her footing and parried a fist aimed at her temple. The two girls exchanged blows. During the skirmish, Naruto noticed 3 water bottles attached to the back of Natsuki's left hip, revealing the source of her water. Finally, Naruto managed to drive her kunai into Natsuki's chest, only for her adversary to explode into water. As the water cascaded down, Naruto realized her grave error. She had taken her eyes off the real Natsuki and was now paying the price. "Ugh," she groaned, biting back a scream as Natsuki's kunai found a mark in her right side. "Not so clever now, are you?" Natsuki taunted, stepping back and forming hand seals. "By the way, you're not the only one with a side hobby." Naruto stumbled back, clutching the kunai embedded deeply in her side. She could feel it. Poison. Damn it, she thought, pulling the kunai out. I have to end this now. I shouldn't have underestimated her. Deep within the seal, in a sewer-like confinement that mirrored her mind, large, slit pupil, crimson eyes slowly opened. No, Kasumi muttered as the scene unfolded before her. Naruto! She exclaimed, unsure how to assist her friend. She couldn't believe the Kirinin had outmaneuvered Naruto. She hadn't even noticed the girl's movements, nor had she seen the water clone until it was already behind Naruto. Kasumi barely registered the girl's presence as she observed the battle with the water clone. It seemed like the Kirinin was merely standing there. Koji snarled, his fists clenched, glaring at the Kirinin as Naruto stumbled back, her face paling. Naruto slowly extracted the kunai from her side and dropped it at her feet, breathing heavily. This was unusual. Naruto did not tire easily. A genjutsu, Mikoto-sensei stated. The girl is adept in genjutsu, so much so that it affects us slightly. Koji shook his head in realization. That's why we couldn't track her movements well. It's almost like being invisible for a brief period. Naruto experiences the full effect, but we get a near insignificant version of it, he said, understanding what his sensei and clan head meant. Confound it, Kasumi nearly hissed, sounding peculiarly like a cat. There is one beneficial aspect of her wound, Mikoto-sensei began, eliciting surprised glances from her two students. She smiled and continued, it has disrupted the genjutsu's effects on her. The likelihood of her succumbing to another genjutsu with that wound is negligible, at least not from a Jinan. Mikoto refrained from mentioning that Naruto would likely be fully healed within minutes. However, the wound seemed to be healing unusually slowly, and Naruto's dazed behavior suggested the kunai was poisoned. Come on, Naruto, Mikoto thought, her eyes narrowing slightly. You can overcome this. Within Naruto, the drowsy Kyuubi's large, rabbit-like ears twitched. My vessel. She is not as foolish as I feared, he muttered, tilting his head and yawning widely. But she remains a foolish human. This level of poison would have killed her within minutes without my intervention. If she hadn't bled out first. Smirking, the Kyuubi allowed more of his chakra to seep out, accelerating the healing process that had begun while he was sleeping. That should suffice, he muttered, lowering his head and narrowing his eyes. Now, back to sleep. Hopefully, this foolish girl won't get herself killed. Cursed Yondaime, Kyuubi thought as he closed his eyes to rest again. Sealing me into this mortal vessel. All there is to do is sleep. As much as she loathed to admit it, the moment she felt the poison recede slightly, Naruto knew she owed her life to the giant fox within her. Without him, she would likely be dead or nearly so. Raiten, Kangekaha, lightning release, wave of inspiration. Naruto's eyes widened in recognition of the jutsu, as she had been studying her secondary affinity, lightning, for some time. Naruto, below you. She heard Koji yell. She looked down and gasped. Water. The water from the water clone had backed her into a corner. As the electrical current found the ground and traveled toward her through the water she stood in, Naruto drew as much chakra as she could and leapt straight up. She soared upward, 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. As she ascended, she performed hand seals and gathered as much chakra as possible. She didn't know any advanced lightning ninjutsu besides her lightning foxes and a few lower-level techniques, none of which would work in her current situation. She knew no earth or water jutsu, nor would she be adept at using them. Water jutsu required a nearby water source, which was scarce in Suna's desert environment. Wind it was, then. Futon, Atsugai, wind release, pressure damage. A massive wind began to build, compressing into a tornado-like form. As she began to descend, she released it at the stunned Kirinin. The Atsugai had been taught to her by Shisui and Itachi, who had witnessed and copied it with their Sharingan during a mission. Neither of them often utilized wind techniques, but recognizing her affinity for it, they had instructed her extensively. She suspected they believed she might have a natural inclination towards wind, as wind-based jutsu had always come more easily to her. They had dedicated 2 months to assisting her in honing this skill, and it had taken considerable time for her to achieve the necessary control. Though it was not yet perfected, it was sufficiently lethal. Mastery of her wind element was essential to unlock its full potential. Her capability to perform an S-rank ninjutsu spoke volumes about her prowess. As she landed, feet touching the ground in front of the water still crackling with remnants of the lightning jutsu, her winds had already ensnared Natsuki. The force propelled Natsuki into the arena wall, causing it to crack and shatter, along with parts of the arena itself. Natsuki bore several deep gashes on her body. When the winds dissipated, she fell from the human-shaped crater in the wall and hit the ground face first, unmoving. Breathing heavily, Naruto fought the urge to drop to one knee. "Winner, Uzumaki Naruto," the proctor announced. "Medics, please attend to the injured." Naruto exhaled deeply and made her way toward her friends. Upon arrival, Kasumi immediately began examining her for injuries, her hands moving to Naruto's bloody right side. As Kasumi pulled aside the torn fabric of Naruto's kimono blouse, she revealed a fresh pink scar where Naruto had partially healed herself. The wound was still tender and susceptible to reopening with excessive movement or impact. "Good, you've nearly healed," Kasumi said, forming a sign as her hands began to glow with healing chakra. "I'll finish the healing for you. Congratulations on your victory in that jutsu. I don't think you've ever executed it with such power before." It was the same jutsu used in her and Koji's combination attack, but she had never channeled that much chakra into it before. This time she'd held little back, knowing she had to end the fight before it went on any longer. Nearly 10 minutes was far too long. "Thanks," she said. "That girl's a genjutsu user, isn't she?" "So you did notice," Koji said, smirking slightly. "For a moment I thought you were still unaware of that." Naruto rolled her eyes. "I caught on, but you know how bad I am at genjutsu," she said. It was true, Koji had used a few to win spars against her. "Naruto," Mikoto-sensei began, drawing the blonde's attention to her. "That kunai, it was poisoned, wasn't it?" Koji and Kasumi both gasped quietly and looked at Naruto startled. "Boo, but I couldn't find any poison in her body when I healed her," Kasumi exclaimed. Naruto smiled. "He burned it out of my system for me, I think," she muttered quietly. Koji and Kasumi blinked and then nodded. The QB being sealed in Naruto was a S-rank secret that only the Hokage or Naruto herself could reveal without penalty of death hanging over them. Almost a year after she'd found out, she'd decided her teammates had a right to know that she was a Jinchuriki. At first it had caused a small rift between her and Kasumi, but after a day or two she'd come to Naruto and apologized for reacting badly. That it was a lot to take in, especially since she'd lost family in the Kyuubi attack like nearly everyone else. Naruto had been relieved Kasumi still wanted to be her friend and didn't think of her as the Kyuubi himself. Koji had taken it better. He'd been quiet for a while, but eventually he'd smiled slightly and shrugged, saying it didn't matter. She was still Naruto to him. The fact she had the Kyuubi sealed within her wasn't brought up commonly between Team Mikoto. Actually, she could count the amount of times on one hand even now. Taking into consideration all of this, Koji and Kasumi realized who he was after a few seconds. They nodded and turned back to the arena, realizing shortly that another fight had begun and ended during their conversation. The fight they'd missed had been between Haruka of Suna and Tsukiko of Kumo. Tsukiko had won, but they'd only caught the end of the fight, which ended with Haruka knocked out. "Looks like it's your turn, Kasumi," Naruto said, and Koji frowned and turned his attention to Yoko of Iwa, who was heading down to the arena since it was her who was to fight Kasumi. "Be careful, Kasumi," he said, catching the girl's arm gently as she walked past. "There is something wrong about Yoko." "Besides being from Iwa?" Kasumi muttered. "I'm beginning to think all Iwa nin are cracked mentally," Naruto said, sighing. Mikoto-sensei snorted. "They've just not moved on yet. You have to remember, grief makes people to do strange things. Sometimes it will break a person," she said, and then smiled encouragingly at Kasumi. "Do your best, Kasumi." Kasumi nodded and she and Mizmaru headed down to the arena. Keiyu Yoko had been a Jinan for 2 years now, along with her fraternal twin, Keiyu Yokina. Both had lost family in the Third Shinobi War, but unlike many others, neither girl felt the need to hate Konoha or the newly revealed daughter of the Yellow Flash of Konoha. They were above such hatred. The whole sins of the father bullshit, and the twins had grown up with their remaining family. A cousin and his parents. The Keiyu family was not considered a clan, having only a handful of members, and not all of them shinobi. They were simply a family. Yoko and Yokina's parents had been killed in the war, along with their grandfather, 2 uncles and aunt. The only ones left were a cousin and his parents. Their cousin's mother being their second cousin, so it wasn't exactly a close relation, but the only relation old enough to care for them. Growing up, the girls were always attached to each other, yet polar opposites. Yokina, the older, was calm yet optimistic. She loved nearly everything and hated very little. She was sort of naive, or so some would say. They weren't identical twins, so it was a bit easy to tell them apart at most times. They had near identical features, but almost enough differences they were easy enough to tell apart. Yoko had lighter skin than Yokina. Yokina had sharper cheekbones and purple eyes while she had black eyes. Yokina had grass-green hair and she had lighter, seafoam green hair and 2 short low ponytails. Yokina kept her loose, except for part of it which she held back with a black bow in the back, the waist-length locks falling loose otherwise. Yoko had wanted to be a kunoichi since she was 3 years old. Yokina had wanted to be there for her younger sister. To protect her, and being a ninja was the only way to do so. Upon graduating, they'd been put on separate teams. Another large difference was that Yoko was much more vocal than her sister, short-tempered at times yet calm as well. She could hold a grudge and didn't see the world with the optimism of her sister. To add insult to injury, she was said to be the perfect candidate for T&I, torture and interrogation because of sadistic streak. It was actually Yoko's goal in life. A few months before, when Yokina had died on a C-rank mission, a mission which should have been easy, Yoko had snapped. She wasn't the same. She trained and strove for power, she had striven to prove something, what she wasn't exactly sure. She had begun to believe her twin sister's strength lived on through her, that her sister wasn't gone but with her, helping her to her goal. She viewed the exam she was currently in, not as a promotion chance, but as a way of proving her worth. As a way of challenging herself. To test her strength. If a few others died by her hand in the way to test herself, well, it was their fault for not being stronger. They'd signed the waivers after all. She was quickly gaining a name in Iwa as the Akuma no Iwagakure, or Devil of the Hidden Rock Village. Her apprenticeship into T&I made people that much more weary of her. So, that brings us back to her current fight against a Konoha nin. Yoko had watched the remaining team from Konoha during the first round of the tournament, and she'd been impressed. From what she'd seen, they were the best in the exam, and she could only test herself truly against the best. By defeating or even killing all of Team 7, she would soothe her broken soul and become one step closer to her goals in life. Become feared even among T&I, and to find a way to bring her sister back. After all, she wasn't gone, not as long as she lived, and proved that she could continue to gain power and best all those to challenge her. "I hope you're ready," Yoko said, falling into a stance, her wakizashi raised and ready to attack. Kasumi narrowed her eyes, grimacing at the gleam in the green-haired girl's eyes, an unsettling grin. She wouldn't admit it, but something about this girl made her instincts all Inuzuka had, go wild. Fight or flight. Pulling out a scroll from her side, Kasumi unsealed it and pulled out a hanbo, or half-staff. It was her weapon of choice other than the standard kunai and shuriken. For the last year she'd been training in hanbojutsu, and while it wasn't common for an Inuzuka to learn something like how to fight with a staff, she'd been determined to break tradition as her sensei had suggested. Her hanbo was of good quality, and about hip length. The thing about the hanbo, many didn't realize that while it was just a staff, and wasn't by any means pointed like a spear might be, and had no blade on it, it could still be used against swords. It was said with the proper training a hanbo could defeat any bladed weapon, and Naruto had gone one step farther for her. The staff she was currently using had been an early 11th birthday present from her and Koji having bought the hanbo, as shops would sell things to him easier than to her, and the seals from her. As alluded to, the staff was covered in seals. Seals which once she pushed her chakra into them would glow, allowing her to channel chakra through the staff, making it stronger not only with hits but durability as well. The seals also allowed it to avoid any sort of damage by weather or age. Those seals didn't exactly need the chakra to work. In reality none did, but pushing her chakra just gave the seals a boost while in battle. The reason for these seals was because of the fact some blades might be strong enough to cut the staff in half. Naruto had done it once when she'd been using Toyota Mahime and Hitakiri. Even a regular kunai could do the job with wind chakra channeled through it, even though the chances of the kunai being destroyed because it wasn't a chakra metal was very, very high. She doubted Yoko would know anything about seals or elemental affinity manipulation though. From the fights she had seen, the greenette had been focused on kenjutsu and genjutsu. Her taijutsu was fairly good, but in a purely taijutsu fight Kasumi was pretty sure any of her teammates, including her, could beat Yoko within 6 or so minutes. If not less. For Kasumi, despite not having a wind affinity, she'd been working on a way to channel her medical jutsu through the staff, more specificity, the Chakura no Mesu. This would allow her to not only have a longer range but given time maybe pushed enough chakra into the technique, possibly with the help of seals if she asked Naruto about it, to do fatal damage. Like that piece of wood will help you, she barely heard Yoko muttered. As burgundy eyes met black, the two charged one another. The fight had many on the edge of their seats. At first it seemed Kasumi held her own against Yoko and the blade she wielded. Kasumi used her hanbo very well, but it was easy to see Yoko had more experience using a specialized weapon such as her wakizashi. Mizmaru attacked from the sides, and worked with Kasumi by causing distractions so that Kasumi could attempt to end the fight. Unfortunately it proved to be difficult. Yoko fought like a demon, and she was focused. She didn't taunt much, and she hadn't monologued once. Usually taunting and monologuing seemed to be half of a fight. Koji and Naruto's fights in the first round proved this, and yet Yoko seemed intent on proving something. You're not quite as good as your teammates, are you? Yoko inquired after she'd broken through Kasumi's defense and slashed the girl in the side as the crimson-haired girl jumped back. Yoko chuckled as the girl's hand went to her side, which ran bloody. A rather deep gash was her reward for failing to defend well enough. Raising her wakizashi to her mouth, her pink tongue darted out and ran along the blade which had traces of the girl's blood. There were sounds of disgust from the crowd, and Kasumi grimaced while Mizmaru, who had run to her partner's side, bore down and growled. When she tongue returned to her mouth, Kasumi could tell that fresh blood ran along the sword now, Yoko's blood. She'd cut her tongue on the blade, and she'd bet anything she'd done so on purpose. This girl. She's not normal, Kasumi thought and then turned to Mizmaru. Get ready girl, we have to end this before. Kasumi gasped as blood splashed onto her face, her eyes wide. Mizmaru. She gasped and fell to the ground, her hanbo fallen to the ground at her side. Reaching out, she hesitantly placed her hand on the white fur of her ninken, which was now stained in the dog's own blood. There was a long, deep gash from the shoulder area below the neck down her hind legs on her left side. The dog was whimpering, and laying still on her right side. Yoko stood like a looming shadow above them, her sword at her side, stoically. Looking up at the girl, she asked, Why? Why did you? This is a fight, isn't it? Yoko asked, tilting her head and grinning in a way that made Kasumi shiver. It's nothing personal, I just wish to prove something. As I thought, you and your dog are not a worthy match for me. Yoko looked at her for a moment more before shrugging. As for why? It is simple, without your partner you're much easier to defeat. And she was in my way. She's crazy, Kasumi thought with realization. I forfeit, Kasumi said loudly, and placed her hands over Mizmaru, her hands glowing with healing chakra. The ability really wasn't as quick or effective on animals as it was on humans, but it would still work. It just took a little more time and chakra, but not much. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be able to heal it to the point it never happened. She wasn't a chakra powerhouse like Naruto, but she'd be able to stop her partner from dying. Winner, Yoko of Iwa. Kasumi watched with a glare at the green-haired girl walked away, back to where the other Genin were, though she noticed most if not all were looking weary or moving out of her way. "Come on Mizu-chan," Kasumi said, sealing her hanbo back and placing it in her pouch, standing and picking the Ninken up in her arms. It was as she struggled to walk she remembered her own wound. Not only had she lost quite a bit of blood but she'd used most of her chakra to heal the deathly wound on Mizmaru. Fuck. She thought and fell to one knee, placing Mizmaru down before she collapsed onto the ground on her front. "Kasumi!" she heard yelled before everything went black. Naruto and Koji watched in horror as their teammate collapsed. They had known there would be powerful opponents in the exam, they knew that they were not invincible, but they hadn't expected such cruelty from another Genin. They had known Yoko was strange, but not unstable. To go after Mizmaru like that, and to not feel anything at the fact she could have killed the Ninken. It wasn't something the two really understood. Not outside of missions where life and death was that much more real. They weren't naive, they knew as ninja their job was essentially to kill the enemy given the chance. Sometimes they would even be expected to take assassination missions no matter what the case. That was the life of a shinobi. But this was just an exam. Death was an expectation especially in the second test, but during the final test statistics showed no one usually died. Maimed at times, yes, but usually death wasn't a common occurrence. Yoko hadn't seemed to care either way. She seemed to want to win, to challenge herself, and that was all. Her words to Kasumi only served to anger Koji and Naruto. "Kasumi will be fine," Mikoto said, snapping them from their angry thoughts. "She's a fighter, as is Mizmaru. The medics will take good care of them." Naruto exhaled in relief, yet her eyes never lightened from their narrowed, hard stare. They followed Yoko as she came to a stop a few feet away, though she noticed not even those from Iwa stayed very close to her. It was as if they were afraid of her. Koji's anger was much more apparent than Naruto's, who was trying to stay calm so she wouldn't lose it and attack the girl. It wouldn't do to be disqualified. His eyes were no longer black, but his Sharingan had been activated, unknown to him. Uchiha glares were impressive, but to have a Uchiha angry at you and glaring with the Sharingan activated was known to have grown ninja pissing themselves, or at least the story said. She'd never seen it happen despite being close to the clan. "She'll pay for that," Koji said, the tone of his voice something Naruto had never heard from the usually laid-back Raven. Narrowing her eyes, and frowning, Naruto nodded. "She will," she said, placing a calming hand on her friend's shoulder. "I promise." She didn't realize how much that promise would come back to bite her in the ass. "The next fight is being called," Mikoto-sensei said, ignoring the words exchanged between her students. She didn't approve of going into a fight with intent to make someone pay, but even she had to admit the girl from Iwa had it coming. She wouldn't lower herself to that level. She was no child or teenager, but her students, while being ninja, were still children and had that right. She just hoped it wouldn't get out of hand. Revenge of this sort never solved anything. Ayane of Suna vs Uchiha Koji. Ayane of Suna was a girl who was good in utilizing her chakra into chakra strings, yet she was not a puppeteer. This wasn't exactly common nor uncommon for Suna, and was actually an advantage for their shinobi. Being able to use chakra strings so competently. Yet Ayane had the worst opponent possible, and unfortunately for her he was still relatively emotional and pissed over what happened to Kasumi. To burn some frustration he resorted to not wasting time and using his Sharingan right off. He hardly gave the lilac-haired girl, a strange hair color but not as strange as some he'd seen recently, any time to prepare. The girl somehow was able to use chakra strings to make cuts. Usually they weren't powerful enough to be deadly or make cuts, but she'd found a way. Probably by willing her chakra to become sharp, similar to wind chakra. Or maybe she was a wind type. Koji didn't know and he didn't care. Though he was bleeding from the cuts he'd gotten from the strings he couldn't evade, Koji had been using his speed, Sharingan and ability with Sunshine to his advantage. "Sorry about this," Ayane heard the Uchiha say before he disappeared from his charge at her, and with wide eyes she looked around her. She saw him appear, via Sunshine, too late, and was knocked unconscious by a knife strike to the back of her neck. Part of her was relieved for that. She'd taken a bit of a beating, though she'd given as good as she got, in the 5 minutes they'd been fighting. Winner, Uchiha Koji. He really wasn't playing around, was he? Naruto questioned, mostly to herself. He needed to work out some of his anger, Mikoto-sensei said. You and Kasumi are his best friends, you know. He's very protective of you both. Naruto smiled, and nodded as Koji headed towards them at a calm pace, his eyes once again a dark gray that was nearly black. There was a small quirk of his lips, but it was gone almost as soon as it was seen. She knew he was still frustrated and angry about Kasumi and Mizmaru, both of which were taken to the hospital by the medics. She didn't blame him, she was too. Kasumi and she hadn't been friends as long as she and Koji had, but she was like an older sister figure at times and a great friend. I just want this exam over already, Koji said, startling Naruto, though she agreed with him. It was great up until the psychos came out, though it seemed Kyo at least had some sense beaten into him. Naruto had doubts anything could be done for Yoko. I want to see Kasumi, make sure she's alright, he finished, and Naruto frowned, nodding. I do too, she said. Hopefully it'll end soon. Let's make a promise, Koji began, looking at her with a smile. If we are put against each other in the next round, we'll put on a short fight and then forfeit. Naruto laughed. Sounds like a great prank. Naruto trailed off. In a way it was sort of like a prank, just not a expected prank idea. I like it. Promise. Mikoto smiled at her two students, and couldn't help but agree with them. She too wanted to check on her student, but she also didn't want to leave until the end of the fights. Either one of her students could be pitted against Yoko, and she, like them, realized just how unstable the seafoam green-haired Iwa Nin was. She didn't know what had happened to her, but if she was this far gone it must have been traumatic. She had a feeling it must have been connected to a death of someone close. She'd seen this sort of insanity before. In Uchihas and ninja forced to face the death of a parent, sibling, lover or close friend. But they had a way of helping these cases because of the Yamanaka clan, who all worked with T&I a lot, also did therapy on the Hokage's request. The Yamanaka wasn't a large clan unlike the Hyuga or Uchiha, and some of the civilians of the clan had actually begun a career as a therapy for shinobi and civilian alike. Nonetheless, she was proud of them. They had made it this far, and showed they were ready for a promotion, even if they did choose to only show an intense spar between teammates/best friends if they faced one another and not attempt to win for the sake of proving one better than the other. That unfortunately did happen in some teams, even in Konoha. Oh no, she heard Koji mutter, and she looked up from her thoughts. Her onyx eyes widened when she saw the names on the board for the first fight of the final round, and she realized she had no idea the last round had ended or who had won. Koji felt as if someone had sat a block of ice in his gut, and stopped it from melting completely. His best friend, the one he was closest to, was going to face the same kunoichi who had put Kasumi and Mizmaru into the hospital. This in itself made him weary of any of them facing the Greenette in the finals. You! He stopped himself, knowing that she wouldn't forfeit before even trying. Sighing, he continued, Be careful, Naru-chan. Naruto took a deep breath, looked at the raven-haired boy and smiled. I will, she said, and then jumped over the railing and into the arena. Koji snorted, shaking his head. So dramatic at times, he said, and Mikoto chuckled from where she stood. Yoko felt a wave of joy as she walked down to the arena, and stood across from the long-haired blonde. The Yondaime's legacy, the heir of two clans. To defeat her would prove everything, and she'd be one step closer to the goals in her existence. Naruto glared at the green-haired girl, trying to figure out what she would do next. She was confident in her skills. She'd come a long way in the years since she'd become a Genin, or even before that when she was in the academy. But Yoko was still a bit of a puzzle. She had shown mostly kenjutsu skills during the exam. What little taijutsu she showed wasn't as strong as hers, Koji's, or even Kasumi's if it were a pure taijutsu battle, and Yoko wasn't just a few shuriken short of being sane. Naruto couldn't recall if the girl had used ninjutsu, or even genjutsu for that matter. "Why did you do that to Kasumi and Mijimaru?" she finally asked a moment after the proctor called the match to begin. "She was your friend, I take it?" Yoko inquired, tilting her head slightly. "You have bonds to your teammates, as I suspected?" Naruto stared at Yoko in shock. "Of course she is. Koji-kun, Kasumi-chan, Mizu-chan, Mikoto-sensei. They're like my family," she exclaimed. "Don't you have that with your team?" she asked. Yoko threw her head back and laughed, not a pleasant one either. This laugh sent shivers down many spines, and caused many to question the greenette's sanity. "I suppose once I did have bonds, but you can hardly have bonds with dead people," she said sardonically. "Though, I use the term dead in the loosest sense. Yokina would never leave me alone. Never." Naruto narrowed her eyes in confusion and realized soon after that she'd made a mistake. She'd given Yoko an opening by talking to her as if they weren't in a fight. Closing her eyes, she focused on one of the few ways to break a genjutsu. It only took a minute or two before she knew she had it, but by the time she'd opened her eyes, Yoko's fist was already too close to dodge. Her eyes widened as the force of the punch drove into her gut, and forced her to double over. Seeing the kick coming towards her back, she pushed past the shock of the blow and shunshined away from it. Quickly she brought her right head up in front of her as she reappeared feet behind Yoko, wishing she could have saved this for if she faced Koji. It was her newest creation, meant for her taijutsu, Raiko Kitsune, or even the one she was currently working on that blended her family styles. It was basically a taijutsu move as it used little chakra, and had no hand signs. The good thing about it was with control, even the little chakra it used could cause serious damage. Unfortunately, while the technique was a lot easier to create than her lightning foxes and had only taken her around 3 months to master, though she had to learn to use senbons rather well, otherwise it would have been pointless. "Rujin no Hari, needles of the dragon god," she called out, though not in a raised voice so she might get a surprise attack on Yoko. Between the knuckles of her 4 fingers, that were curled into a fist, chakra formed into senbon-like needles that were a soft blue color like most chakra, though hers seemed to have a tinge of dark violet in it. With a flick of her wrist the needles were released. Unfortunately for her, Yoko had noticed where she was. If it was by luck, or if Yoko had simply heard her words, Naruto didn't know. She wasn't exactly worried about it as she ran to one side to keep a distance between the two of them. The 3 chakra needles seemed to shock Yoko, and though she was able to draw her wakizashi, she could not block or attempt to block, and they sunk into 3 points on her body. The area just below her navel, the area almost directly between her breast, and in her left shoulder. Naruto wasn't aiming for pressure points in her attack, but because the needles were chakra, and foreign chakra at that, they would sting like a bitch. Not to mention once they dissolved it would act similar to lightning and leave the area numb, though this is simply what happened when she developed it with Mikoto-sensei's help. Mikoto-sensei being the one to show her how to use senbon without hurting herself. If she had hit a pressure point it would be by pure luck, as she hadn't taken the time to aim precisely, and pressure points weren't easy to hit at long range unless the target was relatively stationary. Otherwise it would take a lot of skill and practice. Skill and practice she didn't have yet. "Og, you little!" Yoko exclaimed, stumbling back as the needles began to dissipate. "That hurt." Naruto began going through hand signs, her eyes narrowed. "Futon, Daitapa, wind release, great breakthrough," she called before Yoko could fully recover. The greenette was caught in the winds and forced back, hitting one of the walls with force that almost cracked them. Once the winds had gone, Naruto began to charge at Yoko, unsealing Hitakiri, feeling it was more appropriate for her fight against someone like Yoko, on her way. With her katana at her side she readied to pin the girl to the wall by driving Hitakiri through her shoulder. Clash! "She's good," Really good, Naruto thought as her katana clashed with Yoko's own sword. Jumping back, the two engaged in a battle that was nearly too quick for many to see, at least those who were not ninja. They could see slight sparks when the metal hit and hear the sounds of the swords, but otherwise it was eerily quiet. Many couldn't even detect the sound of their quiet footsteps. Koji sighed as he watched Naruto use another Sunshine to avoid having Yoko run her through with the wakizashi, and reappear on her left and slam her hand into a few pressure points which would leave Yoko's left arm useless. I wish she would end this fight already, he muttered, a bad feeling in his gut. Mikoto sighed. I think she would if she got the opening. Yoko is far from a pushover, Koji, she said. Koji sighed, realizing just how right she was. Yoko was skilled. If she wasn't so batshit crazy, he would easily believe her to be a candidate for promotion. As it was, Koji hoped the girl wasn't promoted, especially seeing as she was in need of serious help. Hurricane no Tsudariki, Hurricane Strike. Koji's eyes widened as the girl made 3 clones, probably earth clones. The fact she could do it without full use of her left arm was amazing in itself, and swung her sword twice in an X-like shape. Chakra flowed from them, into what he assumed would act as blades, heading straight towards Naruto. Naru! Koji yelled in a startling display of concern, for an Uchiha that is. Koji had to close his eyes as he saw her unable to dodge all of them, as it really looked like a hurricane of chakra-made blades, and Naruto let out a short scream as she was forced back onto the ground. His hand clenched at his side, his nails digging crescent-shaped bloody holes into his palms. Naruto was still on the ground when he opened his eyes seconds later. Her clothes were even more torn than before, and bloody. Very bloody, he realized. There was also strands of blonde hair on the ground, glinting in the sun, though her hair was still long. Only an inch or two having been sheared off by the stray chakra blades. Yoko wasted no time and seemed to inhale as she began to mold chakra. It startled and concerned him that she only made a tiger seal, as if it was more to help her than to create a jutsu. The fact she could even use her left arm astounded him. But that seal that was needed, it was only seconds before he realized what she was going to do. Tiger was a common seal for fire ninjutsu. There was almost always a tiger seal involved. Naruto, it's a fire jutsu, move! He shouted, and he saw Naruto stiffen, and begin to rise. He knew the deeper a wound and the quantity of them always factored into her healing factor. His stomach seemed to plummet when he saw it was taking longer than usual. He realized then her wounds must be worse than he'd first thought. Katen, Gokumes Hitsu, fire release, great fire destruction. Koji's eyes widened, as did Mikoto's own. Fire jutsus were not just Uchiha made, that was true. On the other hand, a fair few were made by the clan, most being created by Madara and Izuna, but there were many fire jutsu that were not. That particular one was not, but it was a Konoha technique and most famous for being one of Uchiha Madara's favorite and most used jutsus. The fact that Jinan, one from Iwa no less, was able to use it was unbelievable. It should be impossible. But the proof was in the flames that came from Yoko's mouth, and the A-rank jutsu raced towards the now standing Naruto. Naruto! Naruto gasped as the fire came at her, knowing she would be unable to get out of range in time despite her speed, especially when not all her wounds had healed yet. That left Sunshine, but she doubted even that would work in time, and there wasn't anything to replace herself with, so Kawarimi was out. Am I going to die here? She thought to herself as the flames were reflected in her wide blue eyes. Kasumi flashed through her mind, and Mizmaru and how they'd been beaten by Yoko. How Mizmaru had been hurt near fatally, and she still didn't know if Kasumi was alright. Her precious people began to flash before her as the flames drew closer. Hokage Jiji, Mikoto Sensei, Koji, Itachi, even Sasuke, as much as he annoyed her at times, he was her friend, and others of the Uchiha clan she knew. The last person to appear was Shisui, who she'd thought of as an older brother before his death. Suddenly her eyes widened and she clenched her fist, rage flowing through her. She was only aware of sound roaring in her ears as chakra flowed around her, and the flames reached her. To her surprise, she wasn't being burned, At least not badly. The red chakra which had appeared was protecting her. Red chakra? She thought, startled as she raised her hand to see the chakra which was actually visible around her. It wasn't extremely strong as she expected, seeing as she came to a realization this was not her chakra, this was Kyuubi's. He's protecting me? She thought, blinking, and then she shook her head. Now was not the time. She'd been standing as the flames engulfed her for nearly a full 2 minutes, she had to move, now. As she ran forward she grabbed her dropped katana, which was unharmed by the flames though was rather hot to the touch, and jumped. As she exited the flames she realized her hair was flying around her, no longer held back by any restraint, and that the red chakra had receded almost completely. The chakra around her was now her own blue and dark violet color, though the dark violet seemed to be the more prominent color at the time. It was just a passing notice though, she was more focused on Yoko's wide eyes as she appeared out of the flames nearly unscathed. Smirking, she shunshined behind Yoko and slashed her in the back, a deep wound appearing, and the green-haired girl surging forward a few feet. Both to get away from her and in pain. How? Yoko yelled, turning around with blazing eyes. How did you survive that? Naruto glared, flicking Hitakiri out to the side, blood still running along the surface of the blade. I'm a lot harder to kill than that, she said, Ryujin no Hari. She flicked 3 chakra needles 3 times in quick succession as she ran to the side. While this distracted Yoko, she preformed a Shunshin to appear at her side, kicking her in the chest and sending the Iwa Kunoichi skidding back on the ground. Picking herself up Yoko growled, clenching her fist. The girl was injured rather badly, the deep slash on her back still bleeding, and cuts from where the senbone like needles had pierced her. Her left arm wasn't moving like it had in the beginning thanks to her pressure points attack earlier, and she probably had some bruising on her chest where Naruto's kick collided. I'll kill you, Yoko said, almost too calmly though the hate seeping into her voice was apparent to Naruto. Why? Because I'm beating you? It's just an exam, Yoko, what's the point? She asked. Yoko laughed. I don't care about the exam, she sneered. I'm doing this to measure my skills, to prove something. What? I'm still not 100% sure. What I do know is it will end with your death, Uzumaki. Naruto gasped when the girl appeared in front of her and her fist collided with her solar plexus. Coughing, Naruto was shocked to see blood come out with the spittle the shock of the blow had expelled. It wasn't a large amount, and she knew her body well enough to know it wasn't internal bleeding. It must have been blood from those chakra blades she'd been hit with before. Naruto groaned as the green-haired girl's knee made contact with her face, and she felt the bone in her nose crack and blood flow from it. Stumbling back, Naruto was able to gain her bearings enough to slide her sword between her black obi and the tattered remains of her kimono blouse, and begin going on the defensive as Yoko attacked her with more taijutsu. It wasn't a style exactly, it reminded Naruto a little of how she'd fought before she gained her family scrolls with her clan styles inside. It was more effective than any of her teammates gave the girl credit for, but soon Naruto was able to gain the upper hand. Spinning around, using mostly open palm strikes to divert and block blows from Yoko, she crouched low and struck the girl with a sort of open-palmed knife strike hybrid blow. It hit just below the knee and took the girl's leg out from under her as Naruto began to stand back up, and move her foot to kick the girl in the face. Yoko grabbed onto her ankle and pulled, yanking her feet out from under her, and Naruto gasped as she landed hard on her back. Yoko stood quickly and slammed her foot down on Naruto's chest, causing Naruto's eyes to widen and a short scream to echo from her. Now who is winning? Yoko snarled, her eyes shining with insane light. Still. Not you, Naruto grunted out at the pressure on her chest left and was reapplied but with more force. Og. That's enough, unless Uzumaki can continue to fight this match is over, the proctor called and Naruto gritted her teeth. She didn't want to lose to Yoko, but at the same time she was sort of in a bad position and unable to think of a way to get out of it. Yoko pulled out her wakizashi. It's not over, until I say it's over, Yoko said, glaring at the proctor. Die Uzumaki. Naruto's breath left her as the blade came towards her neck, and she was finally able to get her leg up and kick the girl off with a foot to her gut. As the girl flew back some, her blade missed, and Naruto came to her feet, pulled Hitakiri and made a run for Yoko. Without thinking, Hitakiri flashed and slid with a squelch sound through Yoko's flesh nearly exactly where her heart would be and out the back. Realization came as she saw the blood running to the hilt of her katana and Yoko's black eyes widened. She moved her hand to her chest, blood running onto her pale hands as she did this. "Ha, I guess you were right, I'm not winning after all," she muttered, coughing, and blood ran from her mouth. It splattered, and spots of blood no bigger than lint appeared on Naruto's face. Slowly Naruto began to move back, pulling her katana from the older girl. Choking up more blood, Yoko looked at her, her eyes begging to glaze over, and moved closer. Naruto tried to move back, but fear stuck her to her spot. Naruto's eyes widened as Yoko's bloody hand touched her forehead and then cheek. "Thank you," Yoko said. Her hand fell back to her side, and onto her knees before collapsing onto her front. Blood ran along the area under her and around her, and her eyes stared at nothing. Naruto knew then Yoko, the Akuma no Iwagakure, devil of the Hidden Rock Village, was dead. Winner by death, Uzumaki Naruto. She didn't hear much else as she passed out. The last thing she recalled was the thump as her body hit the ground. What a shame, he hadn't expected the Uzumaki girl to be so brutal. Uchiha Madara, despite all the history book's words, was very much alive. His own secret to eternal youth, one could say, though he would not admit to the fact he was not immortal. No, being immortal meant never dying even when mortally wounded. He could still be killed, it just took a hell of a lot. It was easier to kill an Uzumaki than it was him from his experience and experimentation, and that was saying something considering Uzumakis were a bitch to kill. What with their ungodly healing factor, some had even called it the Uzumaki bloodline, but he knew better. He'd overheard Mito talking of the true bloodline of the Uzumaki clan to her husband once, and that was only the bare basics. Who knew there was a fourth dojutsu in the world? Madara supposed he was one of the few who did. Thankfully it was very, very unlikely Naruto. He had been observing the blonde Jinchuriki long enough to know her name, whatever awakened the fabled bloodline. From what Mito had told Hashirama, the Uzumaki bloodline was similar yet very different from the Sharingan, and there were said to be circumstances to awakening it. Most Uzumaki who did died in the process. There was a reason for that, but she'd never specified much more than that. But this was beside the point. Currently he stood on one of the walls of the stadium of the arena, under a genjutsu as to not be noticed. He'd been watching the exams, and his little... well, he wasn't sure what to call Yoko. Apprentice maybe? He had taught her a few things, though mostly he'd just driven her more into insanity by promises of revenge and power. Promises that she'd be able to have her sister back. He snorted, if it was that easy he may not have fallen into darkness himself when Izuna was killed. And despite what the clan believed, and the history books might say, he hadn't killed his brother. Nor had he stolen his eyes. Izuna, being the bleeding heart he could be at times, had given him his eyes. Madara had been truly angry at his brother for that, but Izuna was an Uchiha, trickery was one of their many games. Being knocked out and having your brother's eyes given to you wasn't that hard to accomplish. Not for Izuna at least, so in all honesty he hadn't even realized until after the surgery. But that was his distant past, a different Madara. A less crazy Madara. He shrugged. He'd have his revenge against Konoha, and his pet returned to him in due time. At the same time he could humor Pain's ideals and use his little organization he formed and led, while Madara led from the shadows, to his own purposes. He did enjoy a bit of chaos now and again. In the end, Keiyu Yoko was a convenient pawn, so easily manipulated for his own purposes. The main purpose was to fight Uzumaki Naruto. It was true he hadn't know if they'd be pitted against each other at all, but he'd trained her and had her team get through to this round for the sole purpose of proving herself. Yoko hadn't even truly realized what her purpose was. She was much too unstable for that kind of clear thought. In all honesty, The words she'd spoken moments before her death were the most clarity the girl had since her twin sister, Yokina, had died on a mission months before. He could say he was impressed with the amount of skill Naruto had, but he'd expected the Jinchuriki of his pet to be powerful. It seemed she could even tap into the Kyuubi's chakra on some unconscious level as shown when she'd survived Yoko's fire jutsu. He had been extremely impressed by that. Not many could say they survived that jutsu, even if it was a Jinan, though Yoko could have easily been high Chunin, close to Jonin level since he'd trained her the last few months off and on himself, who'd used it. Her skill in ninjutsu and taijutsu were indeed astonishing for her age and rank, even if she didn't seem to know many, though the ones she did know were rather high-ranked. The fact she could create 2 original jutsus herself, though he supposed her chakra needles were an unique case for a jutsu since it was not an element nor needed hand seals and seemed to be created for her taijutsu style, added to it. She truly seemed to fit the bill for a prodigy. Her kenjutsu was probably her weakest skill besides genjutsu, and since her genjutsu was basically non-existent, that wasn't saying much. Not to say she was bad, she was quite good with her blades. But of course, he had a feeling that her lack of skill wouldn't stay true in the coming years. She already had an understanding of standard Fuinjutsu, and she was an Uzumaki, meaning Fuinjutsu would come almost naturally to her. Almost. Kenjutsu would take time and practice, but she'd probably be as skilled as her mother one day. And he was truly expecting her to surpass her parents, and give him quite the fight when it came time to reclaim his pet. He smirked, he didn't mind. He loved a good challenge. Koji was outwardly nervous, fidgeting throughout the next fights. There were only a few Jinan left in the exam, counting him and Naruto, so he hoped this wouldn't last long. Though Naruto he was worried about. She had killed Yoko, though with good reason. The Greenette seemed determined to kill her even when the proctor was ready to call the match. Naruto really didn't have a choice, but he'd heard the words, or more like read Yoko's lips to know what she'd told Naruto before she died. Thank you. He didn't know why she said thank you, but he knew how that would mess with his best friend. Naruto had her insecurities. She had her flaws, he knew from past fights how words could get to the blonde. Psychological warfare, though he didn't think Yoko had meant the words to have that sort of effect on Naruto. He really believed Yoko was thankful to Naruto for killing her. Why, he didn't know, and he doubted he ever would. The fight after Naruto's was between Nobu of Kumo and Tsukiko of Kumo. It was a fight that lasted no longer than 6 minutes, opposed to Naruto's which had lasted close to 20, that was simply an estimate as he hadn't been concerned with timing it. Nobu won, and Koji was called to fight him. He could go into the fight, for every detail, but truth be told it was a bit of a blur. Nobu was good, Koji would not deny that. The boy had managed to get hits on him, even with his Sharingan activated, but Koji was like a man on a mission. That mission was to finish this exam and go check on his hurt teammates. Within 10 minutes, again he hadn't timed it, that was simply an estimate, the fight was over, and he had Nobu on the ground with his own weapon against him, which turned out was a tanto, basically a short sword, not much longer than a dagger. The tanto was pointed against his jugular vein, Koji glaring darkly at him with his Sharingan eyes. The message was clear to Nobu. One deep cut and it would probably be over for Nobu, he doubted the medics would get there fast enough. Nobu did the smart thing, he forfeited. A few minutes later the proctor was talking to a medic and the Kazekage. Attention, the Kazekage called, drawing everyone's attention. There was supposed to be one more fight, to determine the winner, but since the other Jinan is in no shape to fight, we've come to a decision. A never-before-seen decision. Since Uzumaki Naruto cannot fight, she and Uchiha Koji will share the victory as joint winners of the Chunin exams. Koji blinked in shock, expecting either it to be postponed a few hours or for him to be declared the winner by default. As everyone began to cheer and clap in agreement to the decision, Koji smiled lightly. Naruto would definitely like the outcome, and they hadn't wanted to fight each other anyways. They had trained together since before they'd been Jinan. They were pretty much on equal ground, assuming Naruto wasn't using Kyuubi chakra. Of course, she never did. When she'd survived Yoko's fire jutsu was the first time he'd seen or felt a manifestation of the fox demon's chakra. Even then it had only been noticeable for barely more than 2 minutes, and he was sure it hadn't been intentional since she didn't even know how to call on it to that extent, or at all to his knowledge. "Come on, Koji," Mikoto-sensei said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Let's go see Kasumi, Mizmaru, and Naruto." Koji smiled, and nodded, and the two left quickly for the hospital. Gaara had been an emotional roller coaster during Naruto's battle against Yoko, and it showed with how erratic his behavior seemed to be as the fight intensified. The fact is, sand was acting on its own, flaring up as if it wanted to jump down and strangle the one who dared hurt his first friend. His only friend. The presence of his father and Yashamaru's hand on his shoulder stopped this from happening. He had been relieved and maybe a bit happy when Naruto had won the fight, killing Yoko in the process. Though he hadn't thought on it much, her killing Yoko and how that made him feel, seeing as Shukaku was more than happy for both of them. He still had a headache from it as he stood beside her bed in the hospital. He hadn't stayed to watch the last fights, he'd been too worried, an emotion he was far from used to experiencing. The surprise on his father's face that he wanted to leave and see Naruto was almost enough to make him laugh. Almost being the key word. It was about 15 minutes before Naruto made a move, and then it was just a twitch of her hand. As he sat there watching, he was relieved when her bright blue eyes opened. "Gaara?" she asked, hoarsely. She'd been cleaned up by the doctors. And she now had bandages around injuries not fully healed, and wore a white hospital gown. Her hair still completely loose, and tinted more red than normal from the blood they couldn't get out. She'd have to do that herself once recovered to leave. "Naruto," he said, and smiled in a barely noticeable manner. Naruto blinked and smiled, sitting up with only slight trouble. "I guess the exams are over?" she said more than asked. Gaara shrugged, and he turned his head when he heard others enter. "It is," a familiar male voice said. "Only a minute or so ago, though. The Kazekage announced the both of us the winners of the tournament. First time it's ever happened, apparently. At least in recorded history." Koji, he realized, and the woman who resembled Koji, probably a clan relative, must be Naruto's sensei. Mikoto-sensei was what the blonde called her. "Cool," Naruto said, grinning. "I'm glad we didn't have to fight, kind of pointless since we fight all the time when we train." Koji nodded, chuckling. Looking between Gaara, who sat quietly as always, his pupilless seafoam-colored eyes not particularly staring at anyone but seemed to focus the most on Naruto, and Naruto herself. He wouldn't lie and say he wasn't kind of jealous of the time she'd been spending with the redhead, but he realized it was good for her to make friends with more than him, Kasumi and his clan. After a few minutes of talking with his mostly recovered teammate, the doctor had come in a few minutes after they arrived, and said Naruto would be able to leave the next afternoon. He and Mikoto left to check on Kasumi and Mizmaru, who were in the room over from Naruto's. Gaara watched them go passively, and sighed. "I'm glad you won your fight," he said, trying to find a way to start a conversation. He'd been learning a bit about this sort of thing, talking in social manners, since he'd met Naruto. But it was still a hard subject for him to grasp a lot of the time. Naruto smiled. "Yeah. So, when I get out tomorrow, do you want to go play at the park we met?" she asked. "We've no really had time to since before the exam started." Gaara blinked and nodded. "Great!" Naruto exclaimed. They talked for nearly 2 more hours, or more like, Naruto did most of the talking. Then, close to sundown, Yashamaru came to collect Gaara. As the two said their goodbyes, Naruto laid back and thought of what lied ahead of her with the Chunin exams over and how her experiences in it would change her. It took Kasumi and Mizmaru about a week after the end of the Chunin exams to recover. Even now they were still rather exhausted would be the best word for it. But they had been seriously hurt, and lost a lot of blood. Naruto on the other hand was out of the hospital the next day. Her Uzumaki healing and Kyubi healing helping the doctors along, and allowing her heal what should have taken close to a week in only a day and a half. She kept her promise to Gaara, and spent the last few days she'd be in Suna with him, and the time she wasn't with him he visited Kasumi, Mizmaru and stayed with Koji. Koji had taken Kasumi's injuries hard, and Naruto knew it was because of his growing feelings for the crimson-haired girl. For some reason the feeling she usually got in her chest when she thought of Koji and the way she'd caught him staring at Kasumi before didn't feel so bad. She supposed the best word for it would be jealousy, and yet it had begun to get to the point where she didn't feel it anymore. Don't get her wrong, it was still there but it was much less apparent. She actually began thinking of the many ways Kasumi and Koji would be good for one another. Though they were all young, in the shinobi world age wasn't much more than a number. She herself didn't think much on the subject of romance, and she had enough trouble with her confusing emotions for Koji to even think of exploring it. She was only 8, turning 9 in 2 months. But Kasumi and Koji were a bit older than her, by 2 years. In a few years maybe she could help them in the right direction. Kami knows they were too stubborn for their own good. That was all beside the point, she actually found her thoughts more focused around her new red-headed friend. Gaara had a long way to go before he understood too much about emotions, and what it was like to have a friend. Hell, she recalled when she'd had the same problem. She couldn't get over how similar their childhoods seemed to be, yet she didn't understand why he was treated so poorly by his village and why his father didn't seem to care. It was the day before she left that she finally had enough of the glares they'd face, or more like he'd face, when they were seen together. One person had actually had the gale to warn her that she should leave the demon bee before he turned on her. She'd had fun scaring the poor civilian with as much killing intent as she could muster, something not as easily done as one might think. Many people had to work many months or years to get a killing intent that actually felt like killing intent, to be blunt. Thankfully she'd felt enough killing intent. She had developed a fairly potent one in the last few years. Gaara. Why does everyone always glare at you? She asked, looking over at Gaara who sat on the swing next to hers. She felt bad for asking when he stiffened and she could see every barrier she'd slowly been getting through come back up. They just do, he said. Gaara was actually terrified. An emotion he'd never really felt like he was feeling it now. He was afraid to tell her the truth. She wasn't from Suna, she didn't know what he truly was, so she had no reason to hate him. If she knew of Shukaku she'd run away too. He had to keep it from her, he couldn't handle it if she left him alone again. He knew she'd be leaving soon, back to Konoha, but if she had said she'd write and visit if she could. Even the distance wouldn't stop the fact they were friends, yet if she left hating him because of Shukaku he would be utterly alone again. My mother died having me. They think I'm a demon, I guess, he said slowly, and it was true. They did think him a demon, and his mother had died in childbirth. Looking over at Naruto cautiously he sighed in relief at the fact she seemed to believe it, yet at the same time he saw the tiny hint of disbelief. As if she could tell there was something he wasn't telling her. Mostly he saw understanding. I understand, the pain of being lonely. I'm an orphan, before I met Koji I was alone. I didn't understand why everyone disliked me either, they looked at me with the same eyes. He saw her face darken, and her eyes narrow in a fox-like way. Like I didn't deserve my existence. Gaara's eyes widened slightly. Existence? He muttered, almost in a questioning manner. Naruto's head snapped up and over to him and slowly her eyes brightened, and she grinned happily. But I showed them, I found the reason for my existence. I found a place to belong, and one day I'll have their respect, and their acknowledgement that I do exist, she said. Gaara blinked, and smiled slightly. Naruto was like him in more ways than he could believe, but at the same time she'd done what he couldn't. She'd begun to prove her right to exist, and yet he wondered what she could have done for her village to dislike her like his disliked him. Our existence is similar, he thought slowly. I will find my reason for existing as well, Naru. For some reason as he looked over at the blonde he couldn't help but think he might have already found it. But of course, being 9 he wasn't sure what it meant, exactly. He just knew she was his best friend. 3 days later Naruto, Koji, and Kasumi arrived back in Konoha wearing their new Chunin vest. They were 3 of 5 to be promoted, the other 2 both being from Team 2, but that didn't matter. It was unusual for an entire team to be promoted, but for the first time in about 10 years they had done just that. It was almost a given that Koji and Naruto became Chunin, though just because they'd won the exams wasn't enough to ensure they made Chunin. It took more than that, but 8 times out of 10 the winner did get promoted. Kasumi, despite not winning against Yoko, had shown what it took to be a Chunin, and that was enough for her to be promoted. Mikoto couldn't be more proud of her team, and was hopeful she'd get to work with her team more in the future. Her recall was supposed to be over once her Jinan team made Chunin, unless she wanted to remain on the active shinobi listing, but she wasn't sure if she wanted to go back to the way things had been before Team 7. Fugaku probably wouldn't make a fuss any longer. He'd long gotten over the fact his wife was back on active duty and a Jonin sensei. He also liked her team well enough, though he usually stayed neutral when it came to most things. He knew Naruto and Koji more than he did Kasumi, seeing as Naruto practically lived in the compound at times. Dye her hair black and set her loose in the Uchiha district and no one would even realize she wasn't an Uchiha at first glance. As it was, no one blinked seeing the blonde there regularly because she was such a normal occurrence. Almost like they'd accepted her into the clan in an honorary way. Even her husband was relatively fond of the blonde, but he'd known Minato and Kushina well enough. Despite outward appearances, and Fugaku's social awkwardness, he was a good man. Though recently. She sighed. She was beginning to think he was going off the deep end. His newest pet project he only let her have some knowledge of concerned her. Itachi was just as concerning to her. He'd been so distant lately, on a whole new level after Shisui died. Team 7, reporting back Hokage-sama, Mikoto said as she stood in front of the admissions desk. The Hokage did spend quite some time there, overlooking missions given. He had been expecting the teams back, so it was no surprise to see him there when they walked in. The Sandaime looked at the trio of Jinan, or former Jinan, he realized upon seeing the 3 in new Chunin vest of Konoha. It was a known fact that unless something happened, emergency-wise, vests were given in the village the exams were hosted. All villages' vests were different, so a few vests were sent over to the hosting village in scrolls to be handed out as seen fit. All not used were sent back with the teams. "I see you 3 were promoted after all," he said. "Well done." Naruto grinned, showing how happy she was without saying the words. Later she'd talk to Gigi about what had happened at the exam. She was still sort of upset about Yoko. She'd talked it out with her team, Mikoto-sensei and even Gaara. Gaara didn't quite understand, though he was a bit fidgety on the topic of killing. She took it for him not having killed before, unknown to her it was the exact opposite. She was on her way of getting over it, especially after Mikoto had told her she'd really had no choice at the time. The fact Yoko had thanked her made it clear the girl was on some level seeking someone to kill her. Probably her whole reason behind testing her abilities against others. "I expect the 3 of you back in a week for a mission. You 3 will continue to work as one cell, and depending on the mission and situation, Mikoto will join as your mission captain," the Hokage said. "You mean she won't always be there with us?" Kasumi questioned. "No, she won't. Chunin are just one rank below Jonin. We trust Chunin to be skilled enough to handle most missions without a Jonin present," he explained, and the Team 7 nodded. Moments later the 3 fresh Chunin left, and Mikoto bowed to the Hokage and followed after her once students seconds later. "We did it!" Naruto exclaimed as she ran up to Itachi, who had his back turned, but of course she knew it was him, and jumped on him piggyback style. Itachi grunted, and his hand flew back to catch Naruto's legs to keep her from falling. Looking back slightly he saw strands of bright sunset hair, blue eyes and whisker marks. He also caught sight of the high Chunin vest collar. He smiled lightly. "I see that, Naru-chan," he said. "Where is mother and your teammates?" Naruto kept her arms around his neck as she looked around her, to find Koji approaching, rolling his eyes, hands stuck in his pockets. "Being slow as usual, Weasel-kun," she said, and Itachi chuckled shortly. "I'm not slow," Koji said, having gotten close enough to have heard them. I just like to take my time. Itachi looked at the boy and mentally grimaced. He looked so much like Shisui, yet at the same time different. Shisui didn't have quite the sharpness in his features that Koji did, but both were as obviously related as he and Sasuke were. He couldn't help but think of the outcome of what his father and the rest of the clan were thinking of doing. He knew it could only end badly, and he feared it would end in the clan's destruction. I see you were promoted as well, Koji-kun. Koji nodded. He began, we all were. It was a hard exam though. Itachi nodded. The Chunin exam always are, he said. Come on, I'll treat you both to ramen once I pick Sasuke up from the academy. Naruto cheered, not even caring she had to spend time with Sasuke. After all, she would never admit it, but Sasuke was sort of her friend as well. Sort of, they had a friendly rivalry more than anything. Itachi sighed as he palmed his eyes in frustration. His father's ideas of grandeur were beginning to take a toll on everyone, especially him and his mother. It had been only a few months ago he'd noticed his father working on projects that he'd only give the bare minimum of knowledge to others. That had changed the week following his mother's return from Suna with her team, or once team as they were all Chunin now. Koji's family had a small celebration the day after the team returned, which had been held at Koji's. Team 7 was of course there, both Koji's parents, Uchiha Koro and Uchiha Asami, and his family. Sasuke hadn't exactly wanted to go, at least not that he'd let be shown. He knew Sasuke saw Naruto as a friend in many ways, but at the same time his rival. How he could consider himself a rival to her when she was already a Chunin was beyond him, but he never claimed to understand his brother's logic. He let it be though, a bit of rivalry would be good for his little brother. Sasuke needed some sort of childlike behavior in his life after all. He knew his father was pushing Sasuke to be the best he could, but was also going a bit too far with it, comparing him to Itachi. His mother tried to help, but Itachi could already tell Sasuke doubted their father's love for them. Sometimes even Itachi doubted it, but he knew his father was a hard man a lot of the time, but he was also the head of a large clan. He had to be or be eaten alive. That was why he understood his father's desire to mend the Uchiha name, and to find a strong, happy future for his sons. Either one, though he had pushed for Itachi to be the one in the agreement. It wasn't until a few hours ago he found out what his father was trying to do. He was trying to settle on an agreement with the village council and Hokage about an arranged marriage for one of his sons, preferably his eldest. A marriage between Itachi and Naruto. He knew his father wasn't trying to do this to hurt anyone. He truly thought it would bring happiness to his son and even Naruto, and make the clan prosper. The added bonus of the fact their children would be very strong, a mix of the Uzumaki Namikaze blood with the Uchiha. It would be a sight to behold. Yet, Itachi wasn't exactly happy of what his father was doing. He already knew of how his father was trying to get the clan back where they were politically before the Kyuubi attack happened. But it wasn't working, and Shisui had told him what he knew of his father's plans that he wasn't yet told. A coup if all else failed, and it looked to be failing. But that was beside the point. The marriage, it didn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. It seemed many were against the idea, some for noble reasons. The Hokage because he wanted Naruto to be able to choose her own husband when she was older. The same could be said for Itachi and his mother. Many apparently thought the girl would corrupt the Uchiha more, and others thought giving that sort of power to a clan rumored to have power of the Kyuubi a bad idea. While the other side loved the idea, for the reason they were rumored to have powers of control over the Kyuubi. He of course told his father he didn't see Naruto in more than a platonic way, but like many times in the past his father was playing the selective hearing card. One of his father's many flaws was he couldn't admit he was wrong, and once he got something in his head it would take a bomb dropping on him, literally, to change his mind. Hopefully in the end the idea of arranging a marriage with Naruto would fall through, but Itachi had the strangest feeling it wouldn't go quite like that. He had no doubt that in the end it wouldn't happen, but something told him it would take blood and tears to solve the problem. Itachi opened his eyes once more, looking up slightly towards the blue sky and blinked. Dangling above him was a long object, one his knew very well. Pocky. Now, he wasn't addicted to Pocky, no, that was a complete misconception. Really, it was, but like they say, denial isn't just a river, or whatever. From the looks of it, strawberry Pocky. Since when does Pocky fly? He muttered and looked further up at the chuckles he heard above him. On a high branch, in the tree above him half sat half laid Uzumaki Naruto. He didn't know whether her timing was bad or not. Considering the previous thoughts he'd been having in the situation they were finding themselves in if his father got his way. Pocky, Naru-chan? He inquired, his eyes going from her to the Pocky connected to a bit of ninja wire that was connected to a thin twig of a branch, like a fishing pole he supposed. You looked like you needed a break from reality. So I thought I'd see if weasels would jump for Pocky, she said, smirking. He narrowed his eyes at her, smirking half in amusement at her terrible joke. Probably thought up on the spot, or she had said it to try and get a raise out of him. Apparently she'd made it her mission with her free time to try and get an emotion out of him other than apathy, or that of a rock. He didn't think he was that bad. Did you eat the rest of the Pocky? He asked, and Naruto laughed and began moving the Pocky in a taunting way before him with the branch wire configuration. You have to catch it first, Itachi-kun, she said and gasped a second later when a strong jerk from the Pocky end of the ninja wire made her lose her balance. Itachi groaned as the blonde toppled from her branch and landed practically dead center in his lap. Sighing, he stuck the Pocky he'd captured into his mouth and stared dryly at his friend. "Aw, isn't this cute?" a female voice interrupted anything either could say. Both looked over, blinking as they saw Koji and Kasumi entering the training ground Team 7 frequented, the one known by the Uchiha. Looking at each other, Itachi felt his cheeks warm up marginally as he closed his eyes and realized the awkwardness of their current position. Naruto was in his lap, and people could get the wrong idea easily. Opening them seconds later, he noticed Naruto's eyes were wide, her mouth opened slightly in her shock, and she was nearly tomato red in the face. Kasumi was laughing, her dog barking as if to laugh as well, and Koji. Well, he seemed to have developed a twitch in his right eye. Naruto was quick to jump up from his lap, and scurried closer to her teammates. That wasn't. We were just. I fell. And. Kasumi snickered. I see, you fell and his lap just happened to cushion your. Itachi twitched, similar to Koji. There was something about the way that girl said that. Something perverted. He may not be the best when it came to social things, or the workings of the whole perverted aspects of words and life, but he could read people rather well. There was definitely a double meaning in that sentence. Apparently, Naruto figured it out and turned a whole new shade of red he didn't think possible for anyone to do without painting themselves red. Kasumi, that's not funny and it hardly even makes sense. Naruto exclaimed. And for the love of Kami, stop stealing your brother's dirty books. If I ever meet the person who wrote those orange monstrosities, I'll use them as a pincushion for my Ryujin no Hari. Many miles away in the village of Hot Water, a man with long white hair and red facial marks sneezed before he continued peeping on the local women's hot springs. Itachi continued to twitch as he finished the stick of Pocky. He didn't think girls were allowed to read smut. Now if only he could stop twitching. How do I always get roped into this crap? Naruto wondered as she rubbed her forehead. Naru-obaken. A childish voice called and Naruto looked over to see the child. Once again she was being forced to babysit, this time not for Konohamaru and his little playmates, but for the few children around her and Sasuke's age in the Uchiha clan. There were only 4 of them, and only one was Sasuke's age, the others were older, but not yet ninja. Despite her being younger than the other 3, 10, and 11 respectively, they seemed to look up to her in a strange way, calling her aunt or sister. She wasn't used to it at first, but after a year or 2 she got used to it. This wouldn't be the first time she'd watched them, but she remembered it being far worse when the youngest, the one her age, was younger. Liko, the youngest and only one of the main family, she found it strange how all clans had a similar setup to the Hyuga with main family and branch family, Yet unlike the Hyuga, none of them treated their branch family like slaves. Mikito's aunt's daughter, if Naruto was remembering right. It was Liko who had spoken, and the one who commonly called her aunt. The other three called her sister instead of aunt, mostly. Why Liko decided to call her aunt, she didn't know, but she didn't mind it. Despite not caring for babysitting jobs, Naruto did like children. But she was technically still a child herself, so her patience wasn't as fine-tuned as someone older having the same job. "Yes, Liko-chan?" Naruto asked, coming out of her thoughts. All four of her wards had black hair, and black eyes, which was the most common of the clan. The differences were in gender and facial features. Most Uchiha all shared a sharpness to these features. Though she'd seen some that had rounder faces, and others that had features not quite as sharp. Despite a common similarity, she'd found it wasn't that hard to distinguish. They weren't all identical like the villagers seemed to believe. Apparently many thought if a person had black hair, fair skin, and black eyes, they were most likely an Uchiha. Naruto knew better, and found it amusing that civilians would assume like that. "Can you tell us about your trip to Sunagakure, Wani-chan?" Satomi, the 10-year-old, asked. Naruto frowned for a moment, looking over at the clock before smiling. "Sure, but during lunch. You four finish your homework while I go make something for us to eat," she answered, and the four nodded, hiding their disappointment at having to wait. All four were in the academy, and it being the weekend she remembered being piled with homework. She'd always try to finish it that Friday so she had Saturday and Sunday free to train. She was glad her academy days were over. Usually, Naruto would see if Itachi or Sasuke wanted lunch as well. Or even Mikoto-sensei or Fugaku-sama, but none of them were around. Itachi was on a mission, Sasuke was training with his father, and Mikoto was on a mission as well. Currently their once Shin'an teacher was still on active duty, and would probably stay on active duty for now. It was one of the reasons she was asked to watch the four she was watching. Their parents were either needing time to themselves, or on a mission. There were actually quite a few missions coming in lately, since the Chunin exams. She supposed the Shin'an teams in Suna had made an impression, though she wasn't even sure any daimyo other than the Wind daimyo had been there. Apparently word traveled fast. "Here, I made kitsune udon and some onigiri," she said as she entered the room with the food. Heading for the table, she placed each bowl in their place, laid out the chopsticks, and placed the onigiri in the center of the table for after. She would have to go back for the tea. Liko was the first at the table, sitting comfortably, followed by Satomi, Shinobu, and Taiki. "Did you put Naruto in it?" Shinobu asked, a smirk on his face as he sat down in front of one of the bowls. Naruto gave him a dry look, and raised an eyebrow. "That stopped being funny after the first dozenth times," she said, and then turned. "I'll be back with the tea in a minute." On her way to the kitchen, Naruto stopped back the back entrance and slid the door open. Though not exactly unknown to those in the clan, those not of the clan were not usually privy to the fact there was a training ground in the back of the main family's house. Mikoto had let her watch the children there, seeing as it was the biggest house in the district and she'd need the room watching 4 others. But back to the point. The training ground out back was where Fugaku-sama and Sasuke were. Stepping outside, Naruto instantly saw the two working on Sasuke's fire jutsu. He had managed the coming-of-age fire jutsu already, and his father was now trying to teach him another common Uchiha fire jutsu. This one was causing Sasuke much more trouble, it seemed. "Excuse me, Fugaku-sama," Naruto said, drawing the two attention to her. "I apologize for interrupting, but I thought I should ask if you wish to eat lunch with myself and the others." Sasuke wasn't surprised by Naruto's appearance, he'd seen her in casual clothes before. Though he wasn't that used to her not having her forehead protector on her forehead. Instead he saw it tied around her forearm under the long-sleeved orange-red thin sweater, a black spaghetti strap dress was over this. The dress came down to mid-thigh, and she wore black shinobi sandals, which was normal for not a ninja or if one was not on duty. Her long hair was tied back in 2 low braids and she had a orange-red bandana which made her hair stand out even more. He looked away, hiding a small blush. He'd known Naruto for years now, and considered her his rival, and grudgingly his friend. He couldn't ignore the fact she was rather pretty as well, but he would deny it until he died. "Thank you, Naruto," Fugaku said, nodding. "Sasuke and I have already had a bento, though, after you've eaten I would like to talk to you about something." Naruto blinked, before nodding, bowed respectfully and turned with the intent of returning inside. After sliding the door shut, she headed into the kitchen and grabbed the tray with the tea on it and headed back to the others. They were probably getting impatient by now. After she had eaten and cleaned up, Naruto had gone back to where she knew Fugaku-sama and Sasuke were. Not all that surprising, he had dismissed Sasuke from his training for the day. After that they began to walk through the garden on the other side of the backyard, the garden Mikoto would spend long hours on. Naruto had never seen something quite like it when she'd first seen it. A person could just tell that Mikoto spent a lot of time and work on the large garden. "Naruto, have you given any thought to your future?" Naruto looked at the older man in surprise, a small frown on her face before she shook her head. She truly hadn't given what she would do in the future. Her goal was to find her place in life and get the village to at least respect her. She didn't care if they loved her, or treated her as they did the larger clans, like the Hyuga and Uchiha. Obviously, she just wanted to be treated like a human being by them. She'd accomplished one of them, she'd found a place in life, but she was still working to be recognized. "Not really," she admitted. "I've sort of been focused on my career as a kunoichi." Fugaku nodded. "That is expected," he said. "I'll be blunt and honest with you, Naruto. At first I was weary of the clan's involvement with you. I think you know why." Naruto nodded, her eyes dropped a bit sadly. "But over time I realized it didn't matter. The clan has been losing face since before you were even born, and over time I've come to realize my initial fear was wrong," he said. "Recently I've been trying to arrange something for you and one of my sons." Seeing Naruto's curious look, he continued. "A marriage, Naruto," he explained, and Naruto's eyes widened and the two came to a sudden stop. "A marriage?" she asked hesitantly. He nodded. "I've come to be fond of you, you remind me much of your parents," he said, smiling so slightly it was almost non-existent. "It was talked about once or twice when Kushina was still pregnant with you, but nothing was ever decided since they didn't even know your gender then. Mikoto doesn't wish to push you into anything, but I think you would be able to make either one of my sons happy, and they you, but I would prefer you not be unhappy either." "Oh," she said, and blinked. "So you're asking me if you would agree to a betrothal? The council has been making it difficult, they don't trust the clan much anymore and the rumors of our part in the Kyuubi attack. I am sure you can guess what is making it hard for me to get them to even agree to the arrangement." Naruto nodded, knowing exactly what the council's problem was. The Uchiha clan was not only blamed by some for the Kyuubi attacking, but it was rumored they could use the Sharingan to control the Bijou. Many would either not want her further corruption the Uchiha, and some could possibly want her with them because it was rumored they could control Kyuubi. There was also her clan names. After returning the news of who her parents were, it spread from Wind Country all the way back to Fire Country. The village now knew who her parents were, and while some believed it and now looked at her in pity and regret, while others believed she had killed the true child and there was the fox masquerading as her. So the only thing that had truly changed was people either hated her more, or pitied her and felt sorry for themselves, all things she could do without. Some though, like the clans, would see her marrying into the Uchiha as giving the clan too much power. The power to claim relation to two very prestigious and nearly extinct clans, Uzumaki and Namikaze. Some of them probably wouldn't mind if she married into one of their families. "I don't know, Fugaku-sama, I haven't given it much thought, marriage and love that is. I always assumed I'd." She trailed off with a sigh. She'd always assumed she'd live alone, that marriage just wasn't something for her. Who would want her? She wasn't outlandishly beautiful in her opinion, and she was the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi to boot. "I see," he muttered, almost sadness to his words. "You don't have to be alone, Naruto." Mikoto once told me she believes everyone has that someone out there. It's just a matter of finding them, that is why I agreed to hear you before pushing it any further. Naruto looked at the older man and smiled. If I were to agree to marry one of them, I'd choose Itachi. I know Sasuke is closer to my age, and as a result it would be more obvious for me to choose him, but I can't see myself having more than friendship with him. We're also too similar, I think we'd probably kill each other within a year. While I see Itachi as an older brother now, I could grow past that in the future, she said. But I am only 8, turning 9 soon, I don't know what I want to be tied to one person yet. And I don't want to tie Itachi to me if he doesn't want to either. Fugaku nodded, smiling lightly. You are very much your parents' daughter, Naruto, he said. I can have the arrangement written so that if either of you want to break it in the future it can be broken. But for this to happen you'd both have to be in agreement that it could be broken. Naruto smiled, thinking of the ups and downs of the situation. True, she would have an arranged marriage, but that wasn't uncommon, though not exactly common practice anymore, even in Konoha. Many Hyugas had them, and other clans as well. Even a few civilians had them. Though it was more common among nobles. Her mother might have even had one had Whirlpool not been destroyed, though she was thankful she hadn't or she might never have been born. She did wish she'd have been able to see her mother home village without it being in ruins. But she digressed. She knew she could be happy with Itachi, and she hoped he could say the same about her, but at the same time she knew it might never be the kind of true love she'd read about in books. She was a girl, she was guilty of reading a trashy romance novel now and then. Soulmates, true love, it was a fantasy to her, something she was sure she'd never receive. So maybe it was settling, but that was okay. On the other hand, there was no promise she'd live long enough to marry anyone. A ninja's life was kill or be killed. Many barely made it into their mid-20s. There was also the fact if by some miracle she did truly fall in love with someone, meet her soulmate, then she could break the contract with Itachi. She had no doubt he would agree, and he knew her well enough to know she'd do the same if he found someone. All in all, she didn't see a problem. Naruto nodded. All right, that's acceptable. I heard from Mother that father talked to you about the arrangement. Naruto turned to look at the familiar figure coming up behind her as she sat on the edge of the roof of her apartment building and stared up at the night stars and moon. She smiled at the weasel-masked Anbu. We tend to meet here a lot, don't we? She said more than asked. Itachi chuckled and nodded. Yes, he said. I guess we do. There was a span of silence between them before Itachi spoke again. How are you? Father said you had agreed to the contract as long as there was the ability to break it with mutual agreement, and it was with me. Blunt as ever, she thought with a small snort. I did, and I am fine. I knew what I was doing when I agreed, and as you said, the contract can be broken at any time by us, she said, and bit her lip. I hope this doesn't make things awkward between us, Itachi-kun. You understand why I chose you if anyone to have this arrangement with. Koji would have been my next choice, but his wasn't a choice given he is part of the branch family. Not to mention these sort of betrothals are between heir of two clans, Itachi said, nodding. I do understand. While you and Sasuke might grow to have feelings for one another, you are also rather similar. While opposites do attract as do those similar to one another, there is a line. You'd probably kill each other with both of your tempers. Itachi smiled at her from under his mask. I too agreed to Father's proposal, I just wanted to make sure Father didn't twist words around and persuade you into this. Uchiha are rather gifted in trickery and mind games after all. Naruto laughed. I'm not too bad at mind games myself, Weasel-kun, she said. But no, Fugaku-sama was very plain and honest with me. I agreed because I have strong connections with your family and clan, and I trust you. I also knew if by some chance I did find someone in the future, or if you did, we could easily agree to break the agreement. Itachi nodded. If that ever happens, just say the word and it'll be done, he said, and he sat down beside her on the building. I think you should head in soon though. I heard Asuma-san had a mission tomorrow and Hokage-sama needed someone to watch his grandson. Naruto froze and looked over at Itachi in slight fear. "You're not serious," she said, and Itachi smirked behind his mask. "Dead serious." Naruto paled dramatically and stood up, careful not to lose her balance and fall. "Thanks for the tip, I'll see you around, Itachi," she said, and Itachi chuckled as he watched the blonde disappear towards the door that had led her to the roof in the first place. Seconds later, Itachi himself was gone, off to finish his patrol of the village. Dear YouTube community, this concludes our content for today. Kindly subscribe to my channel, Anime Octopus, for more engaging content. Thank you for your support.